Okay, our lesson this morning is entitled Blessed, and we're in chapter 30, reading verses 25 through 34, and then 41 through 43. Chapter 30, beginning with verse 25. And it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said to Laban, Send me away, that I may go to my own wives and my children, for whom I have served you, and let me go. For you know my service which I have done for you. And Laban said to him, Please stay, if I have found favor in your eyes, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. Then he said, Name me your wages, and I will give it. So Jacob said to him, You know how I have served you, and how your livestock has been with me. For what you had before I came was little, and it has increased in a great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming, and now when shall I also provide for my own house? And so he said, Well, what shall I give you? Then Jacob said, You shall not give me anything. If you will do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep your flocks. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from there all the speckled and spotted sheep, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and these shall be my wages. So my righteousness will answer for me in time to come, when the subject of my wages has come before you. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and brown among the lambs will be considered stolen if it is with me. And Laban said, Oh, that it were according to your word. And then in verse 41, And it came to pass, whenever the stronger livestock conceived, that Jacob placed the rods before the eyes of the livestock in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the flocks were feeble, he did not put them in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man became exceedingly prosperous, and had large flocks, female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. The last time we looked at Jacob, he had run away from home, and he had stopped at Bethel. Remember, that's where he met God. And he saw this vision of this ladder reaching all the way from earth to heaven and earth back down. And after encountering God at Bethel, Jacob traveled northward. Then he turned toward the east and crossed the Euphrates River and headed toward Haran. Haran today is in northern Turkey. So that's where it was then. Of course, it wasn't Turkey then. Now, Jacob is heading to Haran to go to the home of his uncle Laban, who was his mother's brother. Now, Jacob had two factors that motivated him here. The first factor is his brother Esau had threatened to kill him, so he had to get out of town. Second, he's looking for a non Canaanite wife. He's hoping that he will run into one of his uncle's daughters and that he can pick a wife from one of them. Now, this process that we're talking about here is something called endogamy. Endogamy means and refers to marrying within one's own family. They did this in those days in order to protect and maintain the family's assets, values, and religious traditions. Now, both Jacob's grandfather and father had done this. We know that Abraham married his half-sister Sarah, and his father Isaac married his first cousin Rebekah. And this is exactly what Jacob ends up doing. He marries two of his first cousins. Now, shortly after Jacob arrived in Haran, he went to the city well because he knew that's where the young women always came at the end of the day. And he's hoping that he can find a young woman there. And it is there that he runs into a young woman whose name is Rachel. He strikes up a conversation with her, and he finds out that she is Laban, his uncle's daughter. He tells her that they are cousins, so she invites Jacob to go home with her. He does, and he ends up staying there for a month. And during that month, he begins to work for his uncle Laban, keeping his flocks. Now, from the moment that Jacob saw Rachel, he fell head over heels in love with this young girl. She probably was about 15 or 16. And remember, Jacob is now over 80 years of age. What a young girl would want with an old man like that is beyond me. But in this month that Jacob is working for Laban, Laban sees what a hard worker that Jacob is. And so finally he asks him, he says, name your wages and I'll pay them. What do you want me to give you? Well, Jacob's answer is, if you will give me Rachel, your daughter, in marriage, I will work for you for 7 years. Well, that sounded like a good deal to Laban, so he agreed. And for the next 7 years, Jacob worked for Laban, keeping his flock. The Bible tells us that those 7 years to Jacob seemed like no more than just 7 days. He was so much in love with Rachel, he was willing to wait those 7 years. And at the end of the 7 years, it came time for the wedding day. And on the wedding night, and here's something that always threw me. On the wedding night, and in those days, the way they would do a wedding, the groom would go to his bedroom or his tent, and after dark, the father would bring the bride in and give her to the groom. And that's what happened that night. But the problem is, Laban didn't bring Rachel, he brought his older daughter, Leah. And Jacob didn't realize until the next morning that he had slept with the wrong woman. Well, this made him very, very angry. And so he calls his father-in-law and he says, what have you done to me? And Laban says, well, it's our custom here that we never marry the older daughter before the younger. Well, that didn't satisfy Jacob at all. And so finally, Laban says, well, I tell you what, if you will just continue out the wedding week, I will give you Rachel as a wife as well. But you've got to work for me 7 more years to pay for her. Well, Jacob loved Rachel that much, he agreed. So he's going to end up having to work 14 long years just to get a wife. Now, like I say, he was over 80 when he came to Haran. And 14 years later, this puts him up in his mid-90s. But he's still in love. And so he agrees to all of this. Now, although Leah was Jacob's first wife, Rachel was and would continue to be his favorite wife. He loved her more than he loved Leah. Now, after the marriage to Leah, for the next 4 years, Leah conceived and she gave Jacob 4 sons. And in those 4 years, Rachel could not have any children. For some reason, she couldn't get pregnant. Well, Leah made fun of her sister and chided her about that. And so Rachel's answer was, I will give my servant to Jacob as a wife. He can have children by her, and they will be my children. So she gives her servant Bilhah to Jacob. Bilhah conceives and gives Jacob 2 more sons. Now he's up to 6 sons. Meanwhile, Leah stops bearing children. And she can't take this anymore. So she gives her servant Zilpah to her husband as a wife. And Bilhah gives Jacob 2 more sons. And after all of this, Leah becomes pregnant again, and she gives Jacob 2 more sons and a daughter. And through all of this process, Jacob ends up with 12 sons and 1 daughter. Now let's begin with our lesson where we started with our reading this morning. Now, many people are concerned about wages. And when the time to make the annual budget rolls around, employees are anxious to know whether they're going to get a raise. Now, anyone who's ever had trouble with his wages should be interested in Jacob's relations with his uncle Laban. Laban was a selfish, grasping, devious, deceitful, and dishonest man. In other words, he was as crooked as a snake. Now, if Jacob had been left to the mercy of this man, he would have left this world poorer than he was when he came into it. His uncle was determined to give him nothing. He just wanted to use him. Now, finally, Rachel was able to bear children, and Joseph was born. And after the birth of Joseph, this had been 14 years had gone by. And Jacob decides it's time for me to go home. And so he goes to his uncle and he tells him, I want to go home. Give me my wife and my children and let me go. Well, this didn't set too good with Laban. And here's why. Laban knew that it was because of the efforts of Joseph, and it was because God had blessed Joseph in so many ways that he had become rich. Before Jacob got there, Laban didn't really have all that much. But after Jacob went to work for him, Laban's prosperity increased greatly. Laban does not want Jacob to leave. He doesn't want him to go home because he can see all of the money that he's accumulated dwindling down. Now, fortunately, Jacob had an ally in all of this. This ally is open-handed, he's upright, straightforward, generous, and he's compassionate. Jacob's ally was God. And the secret of Jacob's success in working for Laban is that even in the unpleasant earthly relationship that he had, he was really working for God. God who would protect him and prosper his efforts. Jacob worked as the Apostle Paul advised those of his day. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not men, because you know that the Lord will reward everyone for whatever good he does, whether he is slave or free. And so Jacob went about his work as if he was working for God himself and not Laban. Now, God not only prospered Jacob, indeed, he prospered him beyond his grandest dreams. Remember the vow Jacob made to God? He says, if you will watch over me, and if you will care for me and provide all of my needs, and take me back to my homeland safely, I will serve you. In other words, Jacob was asking God for safety, food, and clothing. But how much better he actually fared. Instead of the mere necessities, God gave him a large family and he gave him great wealth. And as we're going to see, Jacob's wealth came from Laban. Now, Jacob's children, except for Benjamin, who was the last born son, were all born during the time he worked for his father-in-law in Haran. But there was something about the birth of his son Joseph that changed Jacob's focus. He had fulfilled his 14-year obligation to Laban. And having fulfilled his duty to Laban, Jacob now decides it's time to go home. Now, to return home one day had been Jacob's and his mother Rebekah's plan all along. Jacob knew he belonged in the land that God had given to his grandfather and his father and to him. He knew that's where God wanted him to be, so now he decides it's time to go home. So he goes to Laban and he says, give me my wives, give me my children, let me go. Now, the phrase Jacob uses here is an imperative. He says, send me. Jacob was determined to return home and claim his inheritance. Now, look at the next two verses. Jacob wanted to leave, but he wanted to leave with what was his. That is, his wives and his children. This is his second imperative. He says, give them to me. Now, if Jacob had been a slave or an indentured servant, he would have no right to claim either his wives or his children. Now, according to the law of Moses, any children born to a slave or an indentured servant, those children, and even if he got married, the wife belonged to the man's master. But Jacob had worked off his obligation. He had finished his 14 years. So Laban had no legal or moral basis for stopping Jacob. Jacob had worked like a dedicated servant or slave, and he knew Laban was aware of his hard work. Now, there are four elements that stand out in verse 27. First, Jacob seems to have caught Laban off guard. Probably just overnight he said, I'm ready to go home. Let me go. This didn't sit right with Laban. And so, responding, Laban speaks haltingly to Jacob, as if he didn't really know exactly what to say. Yet he knew that he needed to respond graciously to Jacob. Whereas Jacob had given Laban imperatives, Laban responded with an amiable or conciliatory tone. And then second, Laban had learned by divination, which means he had obtained all of his wealth. Now, the process of divination is something that is an abomination to God. God says, don't do it. These practices included consulting idols, or examining animals' liver, or looking at a cup filled with liquid. The Old Testament strictly forbids divination. And then third, Laban's experience showed the superiority of Jacob's God over Laban's God. Laban worshipped idols. Laban knew that the idols that he worshipped couldn't give him what Jacob's God could give him. So he didn't want Jacob to leave him. And so he comes out now and he says, okay, if you will work for me, you just name your wages. I'll pay it whatever it is. Now here Laban revealed how strongly he believed what he had learned through divination. Neither Laban nor his gods were responsible for Laban's recent success. Thus, he's willing to pay Jacob anything and everything to keep him. Now, while Laban here is focusing on wages, totally ignoring Jacob's request to give him his wife and children, Laban had made this same type of offer 14 years earlier, shortly after Jacob arrived. And this open-minded offer demonstrated how desperately Laban wanted to keep Jacob with him, so as to continue to receive the blessings and prosperity to his welfare. Now, the desperation behind Laban's generous offer was not out of concern for the well-being of his daughters and grandchildren. He didn't want his financial increases to lessen at all. He was willing to pay so he could continue accumulating wealth. Now, in verses 29 and 30, Jacob underscored the truthfulness of what he was about to say by beginning with, you know. He emphasized his work for Laban over the past 14 years and how that work had prospered Laban. When Jacob first arrived at Laban's house, he had worked for his uncle for a month, and during that time, Laban saw what a good worker Jacob was. And the fact that Jacob could say that Laban's flocks had fared with him highlights that it was Jacob rather than Laban and his sons who had watched over those flocks. Jacob's work had increased Laban's wealth. And while Jacob worked for him, Laban had gone from having very little to having great wealth. And Jacob wanted to make sure Laban understood what had happened to cause this change of status. Now notice the two words between before and but now. Jacob tells him, before I came, this is what you had. But now that I have been here 14 years, look at what you have now. You see, Jacob is highlighting the fact that the source of Laban's increase was really not his arrival, but the Lord's blessing. Now, Jacob asked his first question, a rhetorical one. Now, old Babylonian herding contracts call for the shepherd of a flock to be paid as his wages 20% of the flock. Now, that's pretty good wages. That hasn't been going on. Jacob's been looking after Laban's flocks for 14 years, and he has received nothing. And so Jacob's question highlighted the fact that after all these years, he was still penniless. And what about his family? When would they get their fair share? And the question was his own answer. The time had arrived. Now, no one likes to feel cheated or likes to feel that someone has taken advantage of them. And once that happens, then their antenna go up. And afterward, they are keenly aware of the details of their future dealings with these persons, lest they be cheated again. So now Jacob is going to put up some safeguards to make sure that Laban does not take advantage of him again. In the next 4 verses, we see what these safeguards are. And so for the 3rd time, Laban presented an open-ended offer. Well, Jacob, what are the wages that you want? And Jacob's response is curious. He says, you don't need to give me anything. Well, that threw Laban. Why would Jacob respond this way? Some Bible commentators think that Jacob was thinking back to the vow that he had made to God, that if God would look after him, then he would serve him. And that Jacob is saying, I don't want any wages, because he believes God is going to take care of him. Now, if this was the case, then Jacob's statement indicates how little he trusted Laban. Jacob himself was a skilled negotiator, and he understood the importance of knowing what to ask and when. He demonstrated this ability when he got his famished brother Esau to swap his blessing for a bowl of stew. Now, Jacob's unusual statement was thus his way of saying, Laban, you can trust me, even though he knew Laban did not trust him. And if this was the case, the statement was Jacob's way of throwing Laban off balance. And so, referring to the request he was about to make as this one thing was his way of softening his coming request. Again, Jacob was demonstrating his excellent negotiating skills. Also, this one thing was a request for Laban to do something and not a request for a wage. It would be like a bartering arrangement. You do this for me, and I'll do this for you. Jacob was not contradicting his earlier declaration of not needing anything from Laban. Now look at Jabin's plan here. Again, shepherds of the Near East were typically paid a percentage of the byproducts of the herd, such as milk, wool, and a percentage of the flock. That, though, was not what Jacob was requesting here. He's not telling him, I want 20% of your flock or your herds. He's asking for his payment to be according to the color of the sheep and the goats. Now, that's a strange request. Now, the most common sheep at that time were something called awasi, or fat-tailed sheep. These awasi sheep were always white. The goats that they raised in that area were usually black goats. And again, that's not what Jacob is requesting. He is not asking for the dark lambs or the white goats. He's asking for all of the multicolored sheep and goats. Well, this sounds like a great deal to Laban, because the multicolored sheep and goats were very few. And so the day they strike this bargain, Laban goes out and he pulls out all of the multicolored sheep and goats and he gives them to Jacob. Now, in no way is Jacob here trying to take advantage of Laban. nor did he fully trust his father-in-law. And so the plan of dividing the sheep meant he would not be able to cheat Laban, but Laban would be unable to cheat him. In other words, Jacob tells Laban, he said, look at it this way. If you ever come to my flock and you find a white sheep there, you'll know that I stole it from you. And if I go to your flock and find any of the multicolored animals, I'll know that you stole them from me. And again, this sounds like a good deal to Laban. He thinks he finally got Jacob where he wants him. And he knows that the sheep and goats that Jacob is asking for is so few, Jacob will never be able to leave him and go back home. Now the animals would be Jacob's wages. Now at this time, money had not yet been invented. In fact, money would not even come into usage for another 1,000 years. Having a large herd of flock was an indicator of wealth. This explains the description of Job's estate. The Bible tells us that Job had 7,000 sheep and goats, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys. And of all the animals just listed, sheep were the most important as an investment for financial stability. They were more easily traded and transported than many other animals. In many instances, sheep functioned as legal tender in the Near East. Now, the agreed upon arrangement had the potential to dramatically increase Jacob's holdings. Given time, he could have amassed a small fortune, and he would not have to return home empty-handed. Now, also built into this arrangement was an automatic method of establishing accountability. It would be easy for he and Laban to check up on each other. We see now the beginning of a change in Jacob. Before he left home, he had deceived his father, he had swindled his brother, and Jacob is now concerned about his integrity. You know what's ironic in this whole thing, especially with Laban giving Jacob the wrong bride that night? Jacob, the grand deceiver, got deceived, didn't he? He got cheated. But now Jacob has seen the light. And so Laban, certain that he had outwitted his son-in-law, accepted the terms of this new arrangement. And that same day, they separated the animals. Laban took control of all the white sheep and all the dark goats, while Jacob took the multicolored sheep and goats. Laban is smiling to himself, knowing that he has outfoxed his son-in-law. And at that point, both men thought they had the upper hand. Now look at verses 41 and 42. Each village typically had a well located in an easily accessible public area. That's probably the well where Jacob met Rachel. But there were many other wells or cisterns in the field that were specifically used by the shepherds to water their flocks. Water would be drawn from these wells and poured into a trough to feed the animals. Jacob comes up with a plan. He takes some limbs and he strips all the bark off of them. He leaves them multicolored, the branches. And he takes these branches and he puts them in the watering trough so that when the sheep come at mating time to get a drink of water, they see these multicolored branches. Now somehow that has an effect on them, and all of the sheep that are born from these animals turn out to be multicolored sheep. Jacob's wising up, isn't he? But is he really cheating here? Who is doing this? It's got to be God. God is behind it. And so as these animals came to watering in the mating season, looking at the variegated branches, they produced variegated offspring. Thus Jacob's herds increased, while Laban's herds began to decrease. This goes on for 7 years or 6 years. And in those 6 years, Jacob amassed a large amount of sheep and goats. He also had servants. In the end, Jacob ended up with a vigorous flock of spotted and speckled animals. And the greatest percentage of all of these animals were multicolored. You see, God had done the miraculous for Jacob and his family. So God blessed Jacob in his efforts. In all total, Jacob worked for Laban for 20 years. He worked 14 years for his 2 wives, 6 years for his herds. And in those last 6 years, Jacob became a very wealthy man. The Hebrew language says that he became very rich. This conveys a sense of force, energy, or strength, and focuses on something that doesn't occur passively or by accident. The Hebrew word translated rich describes something that is literally bursting at the seams. In other words, the Bible tells us Jacob became filthy rich. God had more than fulfilled Jacob's earlier request. He had arrived at Laban's house with nothing. He left a very wealthy man. He ended up with 2 wives, 13 children, servants, flocks, and livestock. Jacob was a man that was truly blessed by God. Next week's lesson, we're going to see that Jacob, when he leaves, and what happens after that. That concludes the lesson this morning. Any questions?